Hi, hi. Welcome to our online discussion of August 28, 2015. So, Christian Debré, myself, and I introduce you Amy Asbrook, who will animate the discussion. Toujours Vivant Not Dead Yet is a project of the Council of Canadians with Disability. Our goal is to inform, unify, and give voice to the disability right opposition to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other ending of life practices that discriminate against people with disabilities. There are many reasons to oppose the legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia. Here are just a few. It's unnecessary. Everyone has the option to commit suicide or refuse medical care and have palliative sedation on demand, already without any new law.
Right, and people really can kill themselves if that's what they want to do. They'll find a way.
Yeah, it's discriminatory. While people without disability receive suicide prevention services if they express a wish to die, people with disabilities will be encouraged and assisted to kill themselves.
Right, and that's unequal. It's discriminatory.
You could not tell more, okay? Choice is an illusion. That's the third one. The choice to die cannot be free as long as people with disability don't have the choice in where and how to live.
And because of discrimination, we really don't have that choice. We don't have self-determination, and allowing people to have assistance to suicide won't give any more self-determination.
And the fourth one, safeguard don't work.
Right.
Where these practices are legal, safeguard do not prevent people from disability from being wrongly killed.
Right.
You just have to look Belgium.
Right.
There's many cases where people who should not be killed have been killed.
Right. Either people who aren't eligible or they change the eligibility criteria. And that also happens in Oregon, but the problem is that people's families don't report these things. And since the doctors who are doing it are the ones who are writing the reports, they don't say there are any problems. So the problems don't show up.
So if you don't see it, it doesn't exist. What does it? They say no, it exists.
Right.
It's not because you don't see it, it doesn't exist.
Right.
Okay, goal of our online discussion are to give disabled people a place to talk about these issues among them ourselves from our point of view.
Right, because our experience is different from the conservatives and progressives who talk about it in the media.
And we are more progressive than anybody else, even progressives.
Right.
Okay, to organize our experience and expertise in dealing with discrimination and medical system.
Yeah, because a lot of people with disabilities spend a lot of time in hospital, and we know what that hospital discrimination can be like, and that isn't always talked about in the discussions and the debate on this issue.
And we are been living ourselves.
Right, exactly.
To talk our place in public debate aside from conservative and progressive.
Right, because the people who support assisted suicides, they're trying to give self-determination, but they're not taking into account that you can't have self-determination in dying if you don't have it in living.
So Amy Asbrook would tell you about our today's subjects.
Right. Today we're going to present the last of our three-part series on the Americans with Disabilities Act. In May, we brought you part one, the precedents, which talked about the laws that came before the ADA. In June, we presented part two, which was the law itself. And now we'll bring you part three, the aftermath. The Americans with Disabilities Act has produced sort of step-by-step change that has happened over the last 25 years. And we see that in public buildings that are buildings open to the public. We can see it in transportation. We can see it in infrastructure. And for me, I've seen that as living in Canada. I go back to the United States and visit, and I see more and more buildings that are accessible. Even little restaurants in small towns eventually have a ramp put up there.
Yeah, it's a great improvement.
Right, and it's certainly a lot more than you see in Montreal, because there is a federal law that obliges businesses to put up those little ramps, and that makes a difference.
And as you will see, and you mostly understand, because of the Constitution of Canada, provinces have responsibility and federal have other responsibility. And to make sure that it's all over Canada, if it is a provincial responsibility, you could not do it like they do in the States.
Right.
And it is exists since the new Constitution of 1982. That's one of the trouble with it.
Right, exactly. During the last 25 years, a lot of court rulings have limited the definition of disability, and they also applied strict interpretations to the definition of who is disabled or who is protected under the law. So in 2008, Congress, upon the recommendation of the National Council on Disability, Congress passed the ADA Amendment Act, which clarified the definition of disability to try to repair the damage that was caused by these many court decisions. And a lot of the court decisions came in cases about employment. So somebody would say that they were discriminated against in a hiring decision or not given a reasonable accommodation. The court said, well, you're not even disabled according to the law. And, you know, Congress felt that that was a misinterpretation of the law. And so they passed another law to clarify.
Yeah, so it became a good improvement. Disability, widening their view of it.
Right, and this is an important thing to keep in mind for here in Canada, because we have a court decision that came out earlier this year that says assisted suicide is a good idea. And we also have Parliament now that has to take action, and Parliament could you know, has the responsibility to clarify what it wants in terms of a policy for suicide prevention. So Parliament could say, well, we really want suicide prevention for everybody, and we don't want anybody to have assisted suicide. So they could make some very strict laws, and so it's up to Parliament to do that.
Yes, it is.
Right. So the question is, have things really gotten better for people with disabilities? A report by the National Council on Disability in 2007 gives us some ideas. And I would say that the report is mixed, but there have been some improvements. That's my experience and somewhat what the report says. Okay.
At least the feeling of most people or most disabled people agree with the report mostly.
Right, and it's interesting because there are people who were born after the ADA has been in effect that don't remember what it was like before, and they don't see that much change, but those of us who lived before certainly see a lot of change. So let's look at Title I, which is the employment section, and there are two things to look at. One is hiring. Do people with disabilities get hired, and also do they get reasonable accommodations? On the question of hiring, what we learn is that 35% of people with disabilities are employed, which is about the same as before the ADA was passed.
So at first sight, it seems that there is no change happening.
Right, exactly. But so remember that that's employed. That means 65% unemployment among people with disabilities.
It's a very, very high rate.
Right, exactly. But one thing to keep in mind is that it's possible the ADA actually has helped, because there are that number includes people who are not interested in being part of the labor market. They feel that they're too disabled or they just can't work. So it's possible that the ADA has actually helped people who really want to get a job, but it's hard to tell. There aren't a lot of statistics.
Yeah, and we could not really decide from a disabled people, is he able or not to work? It's mostly himself who could answer this question.
Right, exactly. The court decisions that we talked about before that limited the definition of disability did create some pretty major hurdles to employment, and the ADA Amendments Act has made some improvements, but it's relatively new, and we're still waiting for more information to see if that situation has improved. But one thing to keep in mind is that people who want to work are still held back by a lack of personal assistance services at home to help them get ready and get out to work, and also by a lack of health insurance, which is a problem for people in the United States, even with Obamacare.
Yeah, so this is a good point for Canada, because
Right.
most people in Canada have free access of health care.
Right.
But in state, even with Obamacare, some people could not get it because it's too expensive, or
Right.
but the law says
And health
everybody,
insurance
but it's
companies-
not really everybody.
Right, health insurance companies still discriminate if you have a pre-existing condition, so people are still struggling to get it, but it's coming into effect over time.
Yeah.
So the other employment issue is, do people get reasonable accommodations? And according to the NCD report, it seems that there has been some improvement, so that once hired, disabled people are somewhat more likely to be get reasonable accommodations than before the ADA was passed. And also, employees who become disabled are more likely to be accommodated than before the law was passed.
So
that's
it's an
good news.
improvement.
Right. And that doesn't mean that lots and lots of people don't get fired. And it's still very, very difficult to bring an employment lawsuit, if you're fired. But it does mean that some more people are being accommodated, and there is more of an expectation that you'll keep your job.
Yeah.
So in Title II, the state and local government, that means they have to comply with the non-discrimination part. One study showed that 65% of local governments have an ADA coordinator. So that's a person.
Only 65.
Only
It's
65.
quite low. It's supposed to, a government is supposed the first organization to respect the law.
Right, exactly. So 2/3 have done that, 1/3 have not. And the ADA coordinator is supposed to do everything from making sure all the services that are offered by the government are available to everybody, to make sure that the sidewalks and the parking lots and such are accessible, to make sure that all the job descriptions don't exclude people with disabilities, and all the policies for hiring comply with the law. So there needs to be somebody who's responsible for that, and most governments do have somebody, but not all. So that's a problem. Some other studies have shown that around 80% of state and local governments have at least looked for help in coming into compliance. That doesn't mean they've done it, but they've gone to websites or
at
whatever.
least 80%, which is let's say a passing note. A passage note, sorry.
Yeah, passing,
it's kind of a minimum one.
Yeah.
They do some effort to pass.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a B.
It's a B. Not so bad.
Right.
For a B.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Some problem areas that are still especially troubling. One is the judicial system. And you would expect that, since the judicial system is about enforcing the law, that they would be in compliance, but no. Both the courts, the court system and the prison system are both very out of compliance. It's very hard to get an interpreter if you go to court, because generally it takes a while to find an interpreter, and they're often reluctant to find you somebody, and the buildings are often old, and even though that's changing over time, it's still a pretty inaccessible system. So
yeah, in Canada it's pretty much the same, except that in some provinces they're existing some kind of free access to law for low-income people.
Well, that exists in the U.S., but that has nothing to do with accessibility.
it could help. But anyway, lower court will not really do something for gets better, but higher court have tendency to respect the law.
Right. So the other issue is that there's still a big problem with getting access to medical equipment. So, for example, examination tables are usually very high, and if you use a wheelchair, it's hard to get onto an exam table. Also, medical equipment like x-ray machines or mammogram machines, they're hard to use if you can't stand up and get to them. So that's still a major problem, not just in doctors' offices, but in hospitals. They don't have enough accessible equipment.
Yeah.
And again, you know, these hospitals are dealing with people who have disabilities. You would expect them to do better, but they don't. And finally, there's still people still have a hard time getting sign language interpreters. There aren't enough interpreters. It's gotten a little better now that people can interpret over Skype, but it's still a problem.
It's not really an equivalent.
Right, and the ADA requires effective communication, and people want to say, oh, well, I can just write notes back and forth, but that's not the same as sign language, because people whose first language is sign language, the written language is very difficult for them. So that's not really effective communication.
So communication is not really a true one.
Right, exactly. So Title III, the public accommodations section, I think there's a general perception that there has been some improvement through this step-by-step change over the years. The only problem is that industry associations don't collect any data on this, either about increased use by people with disabilities of services, or whether business owners have made modifications to their buildings or policies to improve access. So the industry associations aren't collecting any data, and there's not much data. So most of the information that's available is through, you know, polls, surveys.
Okay.
So it's kind of dicey information. And despite the improvement, we see often, and you'll see on our Facebook page, because I often circulate it, information about people, stories about people who've been discriminated against at restaurants, at movie theaters.
It happened to us in Toronto.
Yeah, it's happened to us. It's happened to pretty much everybody I know. So that happens regularly, and it's still a problem. The ADA had there was a decision in 1999. The Supreme Court decided in the case of Olmsted versus Elsie that people with mental disabilities have the right to live in the community and can't be just shoved away in warehouse. And that's a really important decision, because in a sense that means that the ADA grants the right to independent living. That's huge, because before it was just the federal government that kind of mandated that, right? So this way, it's the ADA that says state and local governments, when they have custodial programs to take care of people, they can't shove them in institutions. They have to let them be in the least restrictive environment.
In Canada, we are not so good about it. We have a tendency to just put our old people and disabled people in the storage room somewhere,
right.
Call what they call it again?
Warehouse?
Sorry?
Warehouse?
No, you know, the other name is nursing. Oh, yeah, nursing home.
Yeah.
Bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the groups like ADAPT, American Disabled for Attendant programs today, have been working very hard since the ADA came into effect. And in 2013, they had a major success, which was the first year that federal spending on long-term care spent more on community-based care than on institutions. And that's just a huge thing.
That's the way to work.
Right, and it will be great when Canada gets to that point, but we are a long way from there.
Oh yeah, it's a long way.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah. And in fact, in Canada, a lot of the government really depends a lot on people providing free labor by taking care of family members at home. There's no compensation for that. There are some tax breaks, but if you have to give up your job to take care of a family member, you don't even have any earnings.
Natural helper.
Yeah, exactly.
And you could replace natural by free.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And if you don't have a job, then you're not paying as much tax, and you don't have any taxes to get a break on. So
yeah, so
the really
break release is not a real way to work.
Right, a tax benefit that doesn't help.
Something would help is an amount of money to give to the disabled people to manage himself.
Right.
So it will have the opportunity to have the real care that you need on the time that you need.
Right, and when the kind of situation that can prevent is, for example, a woman who is a single parent. She has a son who's an adolescent, and she should not have to depend on her son to provide personal care for her, like to help her in the bathroom and that kind of thing. That's not appropriate. She should be able to hire somebody to come in and provide personal assistance for her.
Yeah.
But as the situation stands, oftentimes people have to do that. So that's not a good thing. Okay, so the next section of the ADA is a bunch of provisions that were collectively called the telecommunications section. And that sort of gives you an idea of how different the technology was 25 years ago, because that was about telephone and television and that sort of thing. But that's changed a lot.
Quite a lot, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So evolving technology has made a huge difference, just in general in terms of accessibility. And there have been some important decisions that came down under the ADA to give people access to that evolving technology. First of all, in 2006, the National Federation of the Blind won a lawsuit against Target stores because their website was not accessible to blind users.
And what it means is that the site is the door to the online store.
Right, exactly. The court said that Target's website was its entrance to the internet.
And the online store is a store.
Right.
So it's being applied to
the ADA
it
was covered under the ADA, and so they had to make it accessible.
Great.
That was huge, and just because obviously it didn't just apply to Target, it applied to Amazon, it applied to eBay,
we have something like that here?
I don't think so. I don't know. Either. I mean, the thing is about Canada is, in Canada, people want to do the right thing, and they'll go to a certain distance to do the right thing. But, as soon as there's a little problem, they stop. And, then there's nothing that pushes them any further, and that's where it ends. So that's why it's important to have laws, because if you need to go that extra step over that little speed bump, you need to have something behind you to say, yeah, it's nice that you did what you did, but you really have to go the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
And that's why it's good to have the ADA. So in a similar suit in 2012, the National Association of the Deaf brought a complaint against Netflix, a similar thing where it's a service online. They have a
big service provider.
Yep. And NAD demanded that Netflix provide closed captions on the films that they provide. And a judge ruled that Netflix was also covered by the ADA and ruled in NAD's favor.
The thing that bothers me the most is why a company like Netflix did not address a big portion of their customer. Because problem with people with hearing problem are, let's say, 10% of the population, something like that. And so you cut 10% of your customer, and you doesn't care of it.
Right.
Hey, they spend thousands of dollars, many thousands of dollars to just advertising to get very good 0.5% of increasement in their consumer.
Yep.
But they just throw away 10% like that.
And there are a lot of other people who can use closed captioning, like people who are learning English. That really helps them.
Yeah.
So there you go. Okay, so other things that have helped in terms of telecommunications are in the Rehabilitation Act, Section 508, also requires access to the internet, and that has affected federal websites that receive federal funds. And one, as I mentioned before, using Skype to provide interpreter services helped some people, but it's important to remember that that's not always effective communication. There was a case recently that came up of a woman who was pregnant, and the hospital denied her an interpreter in the delivery room. Yep. And so she basically said, no, I need to have an interpreter in the room, because looking at a screen,
it's not the same as somebody on your side.
Yeah, exactly.
And you could see their expression in the face of the people. You could ask questions and things like that.
Right.
Which you could not really do it.
I mean, when you're screaming in labor, you're not necessarily going to stare at a screen.
Show me the screen.
Right. The person had, she had an interpreter for her first baby, and the interpreter tapped her on the shoulder to get her attention several times. So that's very important. So again, the requirement is effective communication. Okay, so let's talk about the ADA and assisted suicide and euthanasia, because that's why we're here, to talk about those things. A lot of activists have believed, and I agree, and Not Dead Yet agrees, that allowing assisted suicide violates the ADA for a bunch of reasons, but the two most important are, one, that it singles out disabled people from among all suicidal people for different treatment. And we talked about that before.
Yeah.
And secondly, that it doesn't provide equal access to suicide prevention services. So it pushes disabled people away from suicidal prevention services, and it still allows people without disabilities to get them. And that's another form of discrimination under the ADA. So those are important points. There were two decisions in the Supreme Court in 1997 that upheld the state prohibitions against assisted suicide, but those decisions did not mention the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Is it good or not?
Well, it's an open question, because that means that if somebody wanted to challenge, because it doesn't have to do with states that allow assisted suicide.
Okay.
So it doesn't really touch that question. So if anybody wanted to challenge a state that allows assisted suicide, they would have to bring a case. But the problem is that nobody has stepped forward complaining about such a case on the basis of disability discrimination. And we've talked about that before, that families don't want to get into the issue because, the problem's over and they don't want to.
Yeah, when the people is dead, nobody really want to
pursue it.
Resurface it. It's done.
Right.
It's over. Please let us in peace.
Right, and that's why the fact that most safeguards are retroactive is so dangerous, because
very little
after the
use
fact.
After the fact.
Right. Okay, so here's the final question is a Canadians with Disabilities Act possible? And the first problem, of course, is that because of issues of federal and provincial jurisdiction in Canada, it would probably be very, very difficult. Because in the US, the ADA works because the federal law tells all the states what to do in all of these areas, but the federal government doesn't have so much power in Canada to tell the provinces what to do in all these different areas. So
the court have the power to do that in Canada, the Supreme Court,
right,
but not the government.
right. Not the
So
federal
we are
government.
stuck with the Constitution of 1982,
Right,
which is kind of impossible to modify.
right, exactly. Well, I mean, amending constitutions is a very difficult process.
Oh yeah.
Right. However, there is a group called Barrier Free Canada, and you can find them at barrierfreecanada.org. And they are trying to get momentum to create a Canadians with Disabilities Act. And I think that they would model it somewhat on the Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And again, you know, having a law behind people's good intentions is always a useful thing. But the final question on this is, if we have a federal law and a provincial law in Quebec that allows assisted suicide, that is essentially saying that the lives of disabled people aren't as valuable as those of non-disabled people, how does that square with having a civil rights law for disabled Canadians? It seems like a contradiction.
It's a direct contradiction.
Right. And it seems like a Canadians with Disabilities Act would be sort of like throwing a bone to disabled people, even while, you know, if you can't get palliative care and you can't get home-based services.
You doesn't really have choice.
Right, you're not going to have choice, and a Canadians with Disabilities Act won't guarantee any of those things, or at least not without some major decisions. So is it really going to be all that helpful? And,
but at the opposite, they will guarantee that you will be killed if you ask.
Right. Yeah, you'll certainly have the right to die. That's one of your rights.
They want you dead.
Right. Not the right to live, but the right to die. So, here's some how to get in touch with us. If you want to watch our videos from the last 2 years, you can search for Euthanasia and Disability either through Google Hangouts on Air or on YouTube, and you'll find our old videos. You can also participate live. If you send me your email address, I will send you a link to join us live just before the Hangout starts, and that it'll be about 15 minutes before the Hangout starts. For more information on subjects that we talk about, you can go to our Facebook page, and that's probably the best place to go because I update that several times a day. And that's at facebook.com/toujourvivant, not dead yet. You can go to our website at tvndy.ca. You can email me at info@tv-ndy.ca, or you can follow me on Twitter at TVNDY. Thanks for being with us. Thank you, Christian, for helping out.
Thank you, Amy.
And have a good week.
Have a good week.
We'll see you next time.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.